Hi everyone and welcome to this video. In this video we'll talk about active imagination. Now some of you have asked about this video, so talk about active imagination, and I will try to address this in a brief introduction. So this video is going to be a brief introduction about active imagination, and I hope that it'll help understand this process to some extent. We'll make other videos on active imagination and its application in the future. Now, what is important to understand at first is active imagination is a process that can be practiced by yourself. It can also be practiced in a therapeutic setting, can be practiced in a group setting. And if you're interested in practicing this in a group setting and learning more about active imagination, go to my website. I'm planning to offer group sessions where we can sort of be in groups of 5 to 10 people and practice sort of this process of active imagination, interpreting, using symbols to interpret those with active imagination techniques in a group setting. So go check out my website, you'll find a link in the description. Now, what is active imagination? Let me just write down the timestamps. Active imagination is a process distinct from mere fantasy or daydreaming. It is a deliberate, conscious engagement with the unconscious, especially the collective unconscious. This technique bridges the gap between the conscious ego and the deeper layers of the psyche, allowing for a dynamic dialogue between the conscious ego and the deeper layers of the psyche. It can be seen as a method of introspection where the inner world is given a voice and where images, feelings, and intuitions can be explored and integrated. Now, by the way, I wrote this, some of you have requested this as well. I wrote a script for this video, and I'll read the script out and then I'll get on to sort of elaborate on some of these contents myself. The process begins with the relaxation of the conscious mind, creating a state conducive to the emergence of unconscious material. And this is especially important because the idea of active imagination is that you let the images that come to mind flow in an associative process, right? This can be achieved through various means, such as meditation, focus on a particular image or idea, or through spontaneous visualizations. We would call them visions, right? Once this material begins to surface, the individual actively engages with it, allowing the unconscious to unfold in a narrative or visual form. There are several key elements to active imagination. Dialogical nature, which is essentially highlighting active imagination to be a dialogue between the conscious and the unconscious minds, if you will. The ego initiates a conversation with the figures or scenarios that emerge, asking questions, expressing emotions, and responding to the unfolding narrative. Now, this asking of questions of the ego has to be relativized. The ego, in the end, can only control so much of the unconscious, and especially the collective unconscious components in later stages of the active imagination process will emerge from themselves, imposing their own questions on the ego's quest. This is why the ego has to move into the background of the dialogue and let the dialogue unfold naturally as a dialogue between that which the ego becomes in the process of the active imagination and the collective unconscious or the unconscious components that are encountered in the process. What this essentially means, I think, is that the process itself gains its own dynamic. That means that although the ego initiates a conversation, the initial steps, the conversation itself becomes distinct from a conversation that the ego would have with the collective unconscious, the ego becoming just an aspect of the dialogue, right, that is represented by collective components, in this case, right, the self, in its manifestation. Another key element of active imagination is its symbolic content. The material that arises in active imagination is rich in symbolism. These symbols are not to be interpreted in a reductive manner, but are to be understood in their own context and allowed to reveal their meanings over time. This is obviously related to the idea of amplification being sort of Jung's method of interpretation of dreams, which is to be applied here. Amplification essentially, in this context, meaning you dive into the symbols that you encounter. So you don't try to understand them again with the conscious mind, but you dive into the symbols. The ultimate goal of active imagination is the integration of unconscious content into conscious awareness. This process fosters individuation which is, as we discussed in multiple videos, the development of a more balanced psyche. By confronting and assimilating, or by confronting and integrating unconscious material, the individual can achieve a greater sense of self-understanding and psychic harmony. Now, obviously, but what is important here again is that assimilation is not the main goal. The goal is this dialogue, and with this dialogue, a certain rupture unfolds, right? A certain rupturing moment, or a certain moment of forced reconsideration of certain aspects of the ego may unfold. Often, the experience of active imagination is best captured as and processed through creative means, such as writing, drawing, painting, or movement. These creative expressions serve as tangible record of the inner journey and can provide further insight when reflected upon. Now, this is what Jung's Red Book is all about, right? So, to illustrate this, let's consider, you can, maybe I'll give you a few examples now of this. You can use active imagination, either in a setting where you simply sit down and you burn a candle, you burn some incense or whatever you burn fire. Don't burn down anything that's valuable. Well, maybe you should, I don't know. But you burn something as a symbol also of sort of the sacrifice that's to come. And then you close your eyes, perhaps, as I'm doing now, and you would imagine something. And the idea is that you need, for active imagination, you need a starting point, and the starting point can either be an active process of imagining, or it can be something that comes to mind. Now, sometimes, like I have this now, like I practice active imagination a lot, and I have this now that when I close my eyes, something comes to mind. And this something, sometimes it's something concrete, something, a worry or a thought, and then you can use this to bounce off of and move towards a more structured or a more, let's say, active process, more steered process, where you're like, okay, well, I want to, let's say, think about this dream. Or sometimes what I do is I think about a particular object, like a flower, or sometimes I tend to think of a hole in the ground that I go down through, and that'll then trigger new associations. And so this natural process of triggering associations and letting those associations naturally flow is perhaps what is most unique to active imagination. And then the process also of not letting go of symbols, but trying to delve into them, although you're not trying to understand them in the process itself, right? And the understanding, so that this process of actually amplifying them, which involves research perhaps, can be gone through after the fact, so after the active imagination. So when you go into your reflection, which is essentially when you're done with the imagination, you may want to write down what you've deliberated upon, just as you would write down a dream and then amplify certain aspects of the dream, just as a fairy tale is written down and you reflect on certain aspects of the fairy tale, right? Like you do the same with active imagination. And in my opinion, active imagination just seems to be sort of a ladder that you can use either to, depending on the image that you prefer, to go up to the heavens or to descend into the underworld, right? Depending on the image you prefer. Again, I think it's more of a descent into the ascent to the heavens via a descent into the underworld, right? And again, it doesn't really matter. It's in the end, it's a transcendental movement, like always, right? It's a descent and ascent. So, but what is important here is that the active imagination process is essentially a process without judgment, right? Like you don't judge the images that come up. Nothing is good or bad. Nothing is right or wrong. It's simply you allow whatever comes to mind to come to mind, and even if those would be fantasies, right? This would be the sort of the Freudian process in the Lacanian and Freudian schools. You have in the therapeutic setting this idea of free association, which is essentially the equivalent to active imagination in those contexts, which is simply you just say whatever comes to mind, and even though that's gibberish most of the time, it's irrelevant, but you form a certain discourse, right? And that's in the speaking cure, talking cure of the Freudian discourse. That's key, right? And here it's not about interpretation of symbols at all. It's more about timestamp. It's more about this idea of associating, And this precise idea of associating is distinct from active imagination, because active imagination is an active process, while this idea of free association is about the talk, it's about the phonemes, it's about the expressions, it's about the slips. Active imagination, that's one difference also between the Jungian and the Freudian therapies. Active imagination and Jungian therapy is about the content as well, while Freud is not so much concerned with and especially Lacan is not so much concerned with the content itself on that level. Now, I guess that's sort of, as an introduction, I guess that's what active imagination is. I think to practice it in everyday life is a practice that you may want to maintain, especially in regards to interpreting dreams. Like if you have a dream, the dream in itself may mean something to you, right? Free association, but it may also be in the context of active imagination. You may add stuff to, especially the symbolic meaning of it, that you can then again write on, deliberate on, and amplify in the specific concrete symbols that you've encountered within the dream and within the active imagination, to sort of padding it out, or what do you say, like cushion it out, if you will. And so this process, it's an iterative process, and it's a developing process, right? Essentially what you're developing is a narrative of yourself that goes beyond the narrative that your ego provides, right? So I hope this helps as a brief introduction to active imagination. Now, if you want more of this content, then please do comment below or leave a like. Thanks very much for watching, and have a great day.